You remember how in previous episodes of the big chapter, chapters of the big story, that's easy to say. You remember how in previous chapters of the big story that David and Solomon and other kings have led the people and the armies of Israel, the Hebrew people, into battle, and they've taken over other villages and towns and nations, and they've made their country bigger. And that, in their eyes at least, has been a good thing. Well, now it happens in reverse back to them. A king called Nebuchadnezzar from a long way away comes over to where they're living and, well, he defeats them. He beats up their armies, he burns Jerusalem and the surrounding towns, and then he goes home and he leaves the old and the frail and the weak people in Jerusalem, but he takes with him the clever people who he can put to work in the areas of law and finance and learning and culture in his own kingdom. He takes with him the strong people who he can put to work. He takes with him the brave people who he can make go into his army. He takes with him the beautiful people who he can make, appear in adverts and stuff like that. So the good news is you'd have all been taken because you're all young, brave, beautiful and clever. So now the people of God find themselves in a place which is a long way from anything that feels like home. And they're left with two questions. Question number one. If bad stuff happens to me, does that mean God doesn't like me? Psst. No, that's not what it means. It just means bad stuff happens sometimes. God always loves you, and the stuff that happens to you every day, well, that's not really a reflection of that. It's just called life. Question number two is, well, if I find myself in a culture where not everybody follows the same rules as me, if I find myself in a culture where God and the worship of God isn't the central point of all thinking and all activity and all geography, if I find myself in a culture where the temple isn't the main thing and that isn't where everyone goes and what everyone does, if I find myself in a culture where I feel a little bit different from everybody else, well, then what do? How do I be? What's important for me and my life to carry on the big story? And let's be honest, that's a question some of us still have. And so in this next phase of the big story, we meet two different kinds of people, the heroes and the zeros. People who respond to these two questions in the same way, but we get to know about some of them because they're heroes and they get their story written down and they get to be celebrities and famous. People like Daniel. Daniel and his mates, well, they're clever. They understand all legal writing and they understand maths and they understand the stars and turns out they understand dreams and they have an ability to make wise decisions. So Nebuchadnezzar puts them in charge of a whole load of stuff. But Daniel and his friends, well, they remember the commandments that God gave their people hundreds of years back about only worshipping one God, the God, only worshipping God and not worshipping idols. And so they decide to live in such a way that, well, they won't bow down to an idol, to a statue, to a model of the king. So when Nebuchadnezzar builds a massive statue of himself and instructs everybody in the nation to bow down and worship it, these guys stand up and they say no. They won't even eat the king's food, even though they're so clever, they're employed by the king and they're allowed to stay in the king's palace. They won't eat the king's food. Why? Because it's been offered to and sacrificed to a different god, to an idol, to a statue. And they're like, no way. They become heroes and their story is written down because nobody thought they'd be able to survive if they were the only ones that didn't bow down and worship a statue. Nobody thought they'd be able to survive if they were the only ones that didn't eat the meat sacrificed to the god. Because who can survive on just vegetables? Crazy. Then there's another hero, a lady called Esther. And even though her childhood and her upbringing is horrendously unfair, she finds herself a poor refugee girl picked out to be a princess who becomes a queen. It's a bizarre story, it's a crazy story, it's not always a nice story, but she finds herself as an adult a queen with the king next to her who's not a kind king and doesn't want to be kind to the people of God, but she understands that maybe her place in history is just to be faithful and courageous and kind and look after the other people around her. And that's what she does, and that's what she convinces the king to do. These people, Daniel and Esther's and others like them, become heroes. And then there's the rest of us, the zeros, the ordinary people, people like you and I, no offence. People who, well, we're not celebrities, we're not famous, nobody knows our name. Our names aren't in the books of history and the stories that everybody tells. But the rest of us, well, they got into these rhythms of meeting regularly, of finding a time and a place and a day in the culture that they existed in to get together and to encourage each other, to spur each other on, to look at each other in the eye and say, hey, you're doing great. I know it doesn't feel like it is, but you are. Keep going. They used to remind each other of the big story because the little part of the story that they're in right now doesn't feel great. So you have to tell the whole story about how God has always been good and he always looks after his children and he's always looking to show his love and his blessing to everybody in the world, no matter where they're from and how that story gets to them. You have to remind each other of the big story sometimes and your part in it. And you have to look at each other in the eye again and say, hey, you are a massive part of this story. You are one of the key players that moves it forward. And it might be that you today move from zero to hero and you get to do something that's brilliant and kind and brave and courageous and generous and loving for somebody else. And maybe it will get written down in a book, but probably not. But don't worry about it. We are the people of God wherever we are. And so, if you ever find yourself in a culture where not everything is centered on God and the worship of God, if you were to ever find yourself in a culture where you feel like you're playing by different rules to other people, if you find yourself in a place where not everybody thinks the same about you and you wonder, how am I supposed to be? What am I supposed to do? How do I remain faithful to God in these circumstances? Well, now you know.